Hi, welcome to Nutshell Recap. Let's continue our story. The man stepped closer to Enid and asked whether he was into men. Seeing him closer, Enid blushed, but he didn't understand his question. So he asked him what he meant by that. Glunn crossed his hands over his chest and asked word by word that he was sexually attracted to men. Enid became flustered, but he had some opinion about men being with other men. He had heard people like that existed, but he was not one of them. He stressed out the sentence that he didn't like men. The man was watching him with scrutiny, but he somewhat believed him because that country didn't allow same-sex marriage. Enid avoided eye contact with him and apologized for staring. It was just that he had never seen someone naked like this. Glunn became suspicious of him. How had he never seen a naked body? Did that mean he was a virgin? This blushing and shy picture of Enid is Glunn's point of view. Glunn became sure that he was lying. A virgin? The typical honey trap that's been in the book for ages. Enid was getting uncomfortable by getting stared at like that. So he asked him who he was and how he ended up there all naked. Hearing it, Glunn became silent for a moment, and then he told him to take him to his house first. He would explain when they would get there. Enid agreed because seeing him without any clothes also made him uneasy. Glunn told him to lead the way. Even he had nothing on him. He was looking a dignified noble. But Enid's eyes would always glue to his bare chest. But when he realized this, he became embarrassed that why couldn't control himself. He stiffly stepped forward and told Glunn to follow him. Enid's cheek had turned red in embarrassment. What's wrong with my eyes? Why do I keep looking at him? I've never been like this before. This kind of thought was whirling in his mind. It probably happened because his body was exceptionally well shaped, Enid thought. Please like and subscribe if you're watching. After a while, Enid seems to remember the track back to his home. While Glunn wasn't fully sure, Enid assured him that he knows his way around the area because he normally takes this path to come and go. But last night was just too hectic for him, and also, he had a kid with him on his back. After speaking this much, he paused and then asked the man if he by any chance had seen a boy around 8 years old. He had brown hair with worn-out clothes. Hearing it, Glunn avoided the eye contact and coughed. And then he made some excuses that he had seen a boy running towards the town, but he was not sure if he was the boy Enid was looking for. Enid hid his emotion and said plainly that it was good to know, and it might be goodbye for now. Glunn was feeling guilty lying to him, so he comforted him that there might be some day he would meet him again, probably. At that moment, he heard some rustle around the area. When he turned to see at the back, what he saw was an arrow coming in the direction of Enid. Any delay would lead to Enid's death, so he reflexively grabbed Enid's arm towards himself, while the arrow landed on the ground where Enid had stood previously. The alchemist was horrified. A chill ran down his spine. Who could it be? Glunn turned back to see because he had thought that he had got all of them while they were fighting. But it was a mistake. Those assassins were talking about Enid because he was seen with the kid last night, and they wanted to capture him. But Glunn had some plan in his mind. He told Enid to turn around and close his eyes, because it won't be a pleasant sight to watch. Enid was stunned to see those black masked men, so he couldn't get what Glunn said at first. Glunn saw him spacing out, so he repeated that he should turn around and close his both eyes and ears. Enid didn't know how his body just obeyed his order, but he followed his lead and turned around. As he had told him, he closed his both eyes and ears. After that, Glunn told him to stay there and he stepped towards those masked men. Those men were confused at first about what were they doing. Should they just shoot them or not? Seeing him loading the arrow in the crossbow, Glunn stated that his crossbow seemed to be burning, and so were his hands. He had a chilly aura around him, and his eyes had also turned blue. The man also seemed to notice the smoke coming out of it, and just as Glunn had said, his hands were also burning. He cried in pain. The other swordsman asked him what was wrong, but then he understood that it was some kind of dark magic. Well, at that time, sexy Glunn had already come closer to those masked men. The man was trembling in fear. He shouted at him about what he had done to his hands, but Glunn commanded him to pick up his crossbow and point it at his own jaw. The man didn't understand why his body was following his command. His mind was a mess, but his body was moving as if he was possessed. The other man wanted to stop him, but he couldn't do so. And just like that, both of them became dead. To understand this, let's go back to the past. The name Grow meant fear for many. The blood of dragons that flowed within their veins was a lethal weapon against humans. And yet, their unique ability to speak the draconic language allowed them to take full control over regular human beings. And that's what happened in these few moments before. Glunn looked at those dead men uninterested, that the way they move and behave resembles nothing more than scum. But one thing was sure, the alchemist was not one of them. Glunn glanced at Enid while thinking that it might be he was taking orders from elsewhere. He had to see. Then he came back to Enid's side and tapped his shoulder that the work was finished. But he also warned him not to look back, because it was unsightly. Enid removed his hands from his ears and agreed. And now they had to take another route because of those men. So without looking back, Enid started to walk towards his home, while Glunn followed him. While they were walking, Enid's mind was still roaming around those assassins. He didn't know what to say at this point. He had his doubts about Glunn if he had killed both of them. He glanced at him. But one thing was clear to Enid: if he hadn't killed them, he would be the one lying dead on the ground. Seeing Enid peeking at him, Glunn was puzzled. Enid thanked him for saving his life, but Glunn told him that it was nothing. He was just returning the favor. Enid was confused about what favor he was talking about. But Glunn couldn't say to him that he was returning the favor of carrying him on his back all night and saving him, despite the fear of dying. So he made up that he had given him his clothes. That's the favor he was returning. Hearing it, Enid was embarrassed because it wasn't a big deal. But then for him, it sounded like fair trade. Yeah, some clothes as underwear for his life. Well, from what he saw, the sexy man was a very generous person. Please like and subscribe. Now coming back to his lab, Enid invited Glunn to come inside. When Glunn stepped in and was looking around, Enid instantly locked the door, which alarmed Glunn, so he asked him why he was doing that. Enid replied while putting the lock that those bad people might come back. He had seen those people with knives at the door yesterday, too. And then he told him to wait there and went to check on the windows upstairs. Glunn watched him going upstairs. Then he hurriedly went to the certificate hanging on the wall, because he was too small to take a close look yesterday. He glanced at the wall behind the certificate and observed it. The color of the wallpaper was different under the frame, which meant that it had been hanging on the wall for quite a bit. Glunn imagination was running wild that there could be a chance that they hired the resident of this particular place as the assassin. At that moment, Enid came back and asked what he was doing. Was there something on the wall? Glunn flinched but composed himself while replying that there was a bug, so he killed it. Enid was embarrassed and told him that after just a few days of no cleaning, the bugs made it their home. Then he handed him a cloth, which he had the biggest one in his wardrobe. He hoped they might fit. Glunn took it and wore it. Now they were relaxed, so Enid asked him again the question he had asked: why was he there all naked by himself in the woods? Enid offered him a hot drink while he sat there. Hearing the question, Glunn again made up some stories that he found a creek inside the woods, so he took a bath there, and when he got out, his clothes were all gone. Someone must have stolen them. Enid listened to all these stories carefully, and he somewhat believed them also. Well, it was hard to believe that there were thieves out in the woods when it was so remote, but it could happen, because he definitely seemed like a noble. Enid was observing his behavior and the way he talked. He probably had some very expensive clothes on. He wished he could examine this man as well. Enid was continuously staring at him while thinking that was he traveling alone without a squire. However, he had his doubts that this man was trying to hide his status because of the way he was letting him, a commoner, talk freely to him. Seeing him staring nonstop, Glunn coughed and asked him if there was something on his face. Enid flinched and came back to reality. He hurriedly denied it and said sorry to him. Then he tried to divert the topic and asked him how he knew that his lab was nearby, because he had told him he knew he was living somewhere nearby. Now Glunn had slipped some information, so he had no choice but to admit that. But he told him that someone had told him about Enid. Enid was surprised. Who could it be? Glunn replied confidently that the person told him that there was a top-class alchemist living in the woods. Then he told him that he had some requests. Would he listen to it? Enid was very surprised to hear that someone in the industry actually recommended him. It was hard to believe at first because no one had ever treated him as a fellow alchemist till now. So Enid was happy and asked Glunn if he could tell him that person's name. Glunn shook his head in denial that he could not say, because that person wanted to remain anonymous. Even so, Enid was flying in the sky, because there was someone out there who wanted to support him. He excitedly asked Glunn what he wanted to request earlier. Whatever he needs, any kind of potion would do. Seeing him very eager all of a sudden, Glunn stopped him and replied that he was not looking for any potions. He came here to get a tattoo removed. Hearing it, Enid felt down because tattoo removal things, that could be done at any temple. But a customer was a customer after all, so he asked him to show the tattoo. He would need to get some stuff depending on its size. Glunn agreed and stood up from his seat, and then he removed the upper robe and turned his back to Enid. Well, this is kinda hot, though. The tattoo looks sexy on him. It is so exquisite. I'm against the removal. But anyway, back to the story. Enid was surprised to see a bigger tattoo. But why a dragon? That was a symbol of bad luck. Enid was thinking when Glunn glanced at him while asking about his thoughts on it. Enid replied that it would take a while since it was much bigger than he thought. He would prepare some anesthetics first. Hearing it, Glunn thought that Enid seemed to have not noticed that the tattoo was actually a spell circle. But it was Glunn's mistake because Enid came closer to him and told him to hold still for a second. And then he asked him when it was applied. Glunn answered that it was 5 years ago. Hearing it, Enid dashed towards his study. Glunn was having doubts about if Enid had figured it out or not. When he came back, he started scribbling the designs on paper. When it was done, Enid told him that he was done, and there were many spell circles overlapping. The last sentence was very shocking to Glunn, because he not only knew that there were spell circles, but he even found out how it was applied. He couldn't believe his eyes. While Enid became angry, he asked Glunn if he already knew that it wasn't a normal tattoo to begin with. Glunn became silent at his question. Enid was disheartened because his silent response told him that he already knew from the beginning. Enid stood up from the chair and stated coldly to him to go back where he had come from. He was not going to accept his request. Please stay tuned, like and subscribe for more. See you guys in the next video. Have a good day ahead. Bye.